Thank you very much. I am very sorry, but this has to be in English. I can't do enough Portuguese. I always feel it's very rude when you come to a country and talk to people in a foreign language, but sometimes one has no choice. But anyway, welcome. Thank you for welcoming me here and inviting me. Today you will be learning a lot about what's been happening to inequalities throughout the world. My job, I think, is mainly to look at this in a more political perspective, but political in a broader sense of things, of where can public policy make a difference. But first, I just want to summarize a few of the changes that have been taking place in inequality around the advanced countries, well, not only the advanced countries, actually, around the world recently. You will probably get this in more detail in this afternoon's sessions, but just to give a kind of basis for my talk. First thing, we know that since the crisis of 2007, 2008, inequality has worsened almost everywhere. In particular, the gap between the top 10% of income earners and the bottom 10% has widened, and the gap between the top 10% and the mean, the average, has widened. So the crisis has been very good news for the very rich, even though they caused the crisis in many ways. Something else that we know more generally is that taxation, public spending, whether it's on transfers or whether it's on the provision of public services, always reduces inequality. If you look at the distribution of income before you look at taxation and public spending, and then you look at it afterwards, the main measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, always declines. So taxing and spending reduces inequality. But we also know that in recent years, not just since the crisis, but for a much longer period, the pressure has been for taxation to be lower and for public spending either to be reduced or to be maintained through debt that is unsustainable. So we know that in recent decades, the main instruments for reducing inequality have been weakened. We also know that the very rich have been taking a bigger share of growth in national wealth. By far, this has mainly happened in the United States. It's happened a bit in Britain, much less actually in the rest of Europe or in Japan. But there is that famous statistic that the OECD produced a few years ago when they said that they looked at at changes in distribution from the end of the 1970s until just before the crisis. So it's looking at a long period of time. And they found that the top 1% of American earners had taken 47% of the growth in income that had taken place in that time. That left 99% of Americans to share the remaining 43%. In the United Kingdom, the figure was 27%. The top 1% took 27% of growth. In Europe, continental Europe, it's much lower. It's something between 5 and 10%. But even then, the top 1% were taking more than their share. Now, why was the OECD interested in this? Because the OECD and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have in recent years been very worried about inequality, which is a change for them. Right? The OECD used to say that we needed more inequality. But they have, in the last few years, they've changed their minds very much about this. Their current position is to say that inequality is reducing economic growth. I think the thing that really started them on this major change of their position on inequality was this fact that the very rich in the United States had taken so much of economic growth. How was it that the rest of the population actually managed to improve their standard of living during that time? And the answer was debt. That not public debt, private debt. That poor and medium income Americans were borrowing enormous amounts of money. You get something similar in Britain and in Ireland and in Spain and in some other countries where people funded consumption through debt. And it was that debt, low income debt, that was the thing that finally caused the crisis. So I think in the thinking of the economists at the OECD, the debt crisis was caused by excessive borrowing by rather poor households. We actually needed those households to keep spending, because it's spending that keeps the capitalist economy going, but they could only spend by borrowing money that in the end was unsustainable. And the reason they had to borrow money was because the rich had taken so much of the growth in actual wealth. So that leads even very orthodox economists thinking maybe inequality is not such a good thing. And so I think in terms of international expert organizations, we are at a certain change in the perception of inequality. But what is strange then is that so far, very little of this has come into democratic politics. In fact, go back just a few years to when there was a kind of dominant centre-left in the United States and in Britain and in Germany, some other places. I talk about the left because the right doesn't believe in reducing inequality. So it's one only talks about the centre-left. The centre-left, I'm thinking of governments of Clinton in the US, of Blair in Britain, of Schroeder in Germany. These governments often did quite a lot, actually, to help poor people. I'm thinking of Britain in particular. Enormous reductions in child poverty, improvements in the quality of public education. But the government did not want to talk about these things. It did not boast. It did not say, look what we've achieved. We're trying to reduce inequality. Keep quiet about this. May not be popular. They thought, we have a phrase in English, I don't know if it translates into other languages easily, to do good by stealth. That is, to do something good secretly, so that people don't know you're doing it. Because they believed that trying to reduce inequality or claiming to reduce inequality would not be popular. Because the working class, who would be the main beneficiaries of this, were declining in numbers. They were becoming a political embarrassment to parties that wanted to look as though they were about the future. So they didn't want to talk. And their main representatives, the trade unions, were getting weaker and weaker. So they didn't want to talk about them. Even if personally these politicians cared a lot actually about inequality. That's why they were in politics. But they didn't want to boast of it. And that's interesting. And now if we move on from there, we now have this, with the exception of Portugal, almost the only exception, possibly Spain, this enormous outburst of right-wing populism, xenophobic populism across most of Europe, East and West, and the United States, and actually affecting, some of you were the debate here last night, we also discussed in India as well, a similar phenomenon. There's enormous outburst of xenophobic populism, which is seen as certainly in Europe and the United States, is seen as an expression of rage by people who felt left behind. very rarely is this expressed as a demand for less inequality of incomes and circumstances of life. There's some exceptions. If you look on the Front National in France, they talk about the need for a stronger welfare state, so long as it's for pure French, not for immigrants. And the Danish extreme right party it talks a similar way. But it's not what Donald Trump talks about. And he talks about bringing jobs back to the steel and mining industries, which won't happen. The main thing that killed those jobs was automation, not China. But he talks about bringing jobs back, but at the same time he believes in reducing taxes on the rich, reducing regulation over banks, which is a major cause of inequality, deregulated banking, major cause of inequality. His campaign is not about reducing inequality. In fact, part of his claim to importance is that he's a very, 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 very rich man. That's one of the reasons people vote for him. And so in Britain, the whole movement around Brexit is nothing to do with inequality. It's about immigrants. And most of these populist movements are about immigrants. So if it's about inequality, it takes a strange target. It actually takes the people who are among the poorest people in the society as being the enemy of the people who feel left behind. And this is a strange way in which the sort of rage and discontent that one might have thought would be about inequality and what's been happening to the financial sector, for example, has actually been turned into this completely different set of issues. So there is a puzzle. At the moment, we find that it's the international organizations like the OECD and the International Monetary Fund that we associate with neoliberal capitalism, who are actually more active about the issue of inequality than politicians in many countries. And the population in many countries too, actually. The OECD is more worried about inequality in America than Americans are. Now, we need to think what would it if politically, I said that the kind of reformist social democrats of the sort of third way period tended not to want to talk about inequality. Supposing politicians of the centre-left, or perhaps of the centre-right, someone like Angela Merkel might want to talk about inequality, or these sort of very centre people on the centre-right. What would they have to talk about? What are the issues that they would need to confront? And what would we need to do to bring inequality into political debate? And it's quite a lot of different things. You'll probably talk about some of these later today in a more expert way than I'm going to do now, but I just want to run through some of the things that have been happening. First of all, the deregulation of finance that eventually produced the crisis of 2007 to 8, as well as damaging everybody in the end, also created enormous inequalities. Because what was happening was that the global banking system was being deregulated. And at the same time, more and more parts of the world were coming in to the global financial system. And so people in that sector and the people who might have regulated that sector believed that there was a kind of a boom, a wonderful load of opportunities that would never end, because it was a kind of expanding universe of money. And what people specialized in was buying and selling risk. So you buy some assets, and there's always a risk with assets, and you didn't estimate what you thought the risk might be. You thought, how much can I sell this to someone else for? And if you could sell it to someone else for more than it had cost you, it was a good deal. And why would someone else buy it from you? Because they, in turn, thought they could sell it on to someone else. So, and what was happening was people were able to make money because every time you sell it on, you sell the risk to a larger number of people. They actually take a smaller proportion of the total risk, and so they can make money out of it. So people were trading in risk. Now, you can only trade in risk if you're very rich, because risk is risky. But so if you start off being rich, you are able to make money by selling assets on to people who would sell assets on, and eventually, of course, someone somewhere was going to get worried, and that's what happened. And once people started to worry, they said, "Oh, perhaps we won't be able to sell this risk on. Perhaps we're going to lose on it." Then the entire thing collapsed. Right? But while it was going, it was reinforcing inequalities, because it was meaning that people who had the capacity to deal in risk were able to get richer and richer and richer, all based on a giant bubble. There was no real wealth at the heart of that, which is why, when it all collapsed, we suddenly found we were very much poorer than we thought we were. Because we'd all lived, although the very rich were the ones who really gained from it, we all benefited a bit. We were all able to consume more because we borrowed money ourselves as part of this system, perhaps to buy a house, or we were able to benefit from the fact that other people were doing that and were therefore spending money they didn't really have. And so everybody benefited from this bubble, and then eventually it collapsed. Now, when it collapsed, it did not have the result, except for a very small number of cases, one or two banks that actually did collapse. It did not have the effect of reducing all that inequality, because the first priority of the recovery from the crisis was to make sure the banks could get profitable again. Because unless they were profitable, they couldn't pay back the enormous support they'd received from governments to prevent them from collapsing. And so the consequence of the crisis was more money had to be given towards the banks, because what we learnt was we couldn't live without them. And there was that famous saying, as part of one of the things that came out of the crisis, that the banks were too big to fail. They can't be allowed to fail. Now, the theory of the capitalist market economy says that failure must always be possible. For a market to work, it has to be easy to enter the market, and it also has to be easy to get out of the market. That a market works smoothly when the collapse of any one firm has no effect on the overall. So coming and going should not affect what's going on. No one should be so big that their collapse shocks the system. And so this means that the economy on which we're totally dependent, this banking economy, is itself a contradiction of the logic of the capitalist market. Because if they're too big to fail, then there's not really a market there. And so one of the main things that's happened as part of the recovery from the crisis is directing more and more resources to support the banks, which produced even more inequality. So when the banking system was doing well, it created more inequality, and when it was doing badly, it created more inequality. I remember during the years just after the crisis, I was working at business school in University of Warwick, and obviously so many firms went into crises. Business schools also went into crisis because business schools depend on managers in mid-career being sent by their firms to take MBA courses, things like that. And there was a sudden stop. Firms right across the economy stopped sending people on MBAs. They couldn't afford it. One sector continued to send us loads of people, and that was banking. They weren't affected by the banking crisis. So the way deregulated finance and the way in which banking is now, it escaped both regulation because of the deregulation move of the 1990s. it escaped regulation, and it's escaped the proper market forces too. So it's become a kind of privileged sector, and alongside it come a series of other business services like accountancy, certain kinds of law, and they also benefited from what was going on in banking, and that has been a major driver of a small number of business services sectors, including banking itself, having rising incomes that ran away from almost everybody else, except for a few footballers and film stars. So that's one of the things that's been going on. A second thing has been tax competition among governments. Now, it was believed always that globalization would lead to what's called a race to the bottom, in that in order to compete, everyone would be dragged down into lower wages, lower social infrastructure. That hasn't happened, because if with globalization you suddenly get the arrival of a lot of very low-income producers, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. These come into the global economy. That does bring down, obviously, the overall level of incomes and quality of social infrastructure around the world. But one of the lessons that rich countries learn from that is, well, we can't be dragged into this down market competition. We have to move up. And so a Portuguese shoe firm will have to, if it's going to survive in the international market against Chinese shoe manufacturers, will have to make better and better, better quality shoes. So it's the opposite of the move down. There's a move up. So you need higher skilled workers, you need better machinery, you need better supporting infrastructure. So the global competition doesn't necessarily force things down. It has the opposite effect for some countries, but there has been that constant downward pressure on tax rates, business taxes, because countries want to attract firms to locate themselves within their borders. And one of the ways you do that is by offering lower corporation tax, lower capital gains tax. So business taxes started to go down, and that meant that people who earn their money from the profits of business rather than providing labor services had started to pay lower taxes. And then the next effect is that people in very senior positions in firms, especially large firms, can redefine their salary as being a profit. And then it's taxed as profit and capital gains, it's not taxed as income. Because what's been happening is, because the working population of a country is largely captive. Not entirely true. There are countries where they have a problem of emigration, but in general, the population is captive. So that if you increase their taxes, they don't go away. They stay there. But firms might go away. So what's happened as a result of global competition is that taxes on profits, capital gains, have come down, throwing more of a burden onto the incomes of ordinary workers. And this has been a major cause of growing inequality. Because people anyone who is in a position to shift their income, redefine it as profit, has a strong incentive to do that. At the same time, though, that hasn't reduced the need for public spending. So what this has produced is a kind of a double crisis of public finance, in that taxation has been shifted more and more onto ordinary working people. So that's been an inegalitarian move, and that then leads to tax resistance among those people, and so governments have either cut public spending or have funded it through debt, which in the end proves unsustainable, as you know. So that's another way in which globalization has actually hurt inequality. It has worsened inequality, not because of that competition of labour incomes to the bottom, but more through the effect of tax incentives, and that the need of government, well, the felt need by governments to attract firms to stay in them by offering them low taxes. A third factor that has been very important in the modern economy has been the geographical location of post-industrial economic activities. Now, manufacturing industry has certain constraints on where it locates itself, partly about raw materials, partly about transport costs, partly also because a large modern factory with all its machinery is not easy to move. Where it starts existing is usually where it stays. The post-industrial economy, concentrated on services and high technology, is much more mobile. Now, when we first started to move into this kind of economy in the 1970s, geographers argued that this would probably reduce geographical inequalities, because these activities can locate themselves anywhere. They don't have many space needs. But actually, it had the opposite has happened. Because they could locate anywhere, they all want to go to the most favoured locations. And because these activities have fewer space needs than manufacturing, they tend not to be so affected by increasing land costs. And so we find among the inequalities that are taking place is an intensification of geographical inequality. That in particular, post-industrial services activities, including finance and information technology activities, want to concentrate in the most dynamic areas. They tend to concentrate around capital cities in relatively small countries. They tend to avoid rather depressed, ugly areas. They go to the beautiful places. And that means that the old industrial areas are not being revived by the location of post-industrial activities in them. Except for public services like health and education that have to be everywhere. Without public services of health, education, social care, some areas would have almost no employment at all, just a few small shops. And so the young people, educated people, are leaving the old areas, and they're increasingly concentrated in capital cities and in, as I say, other beautiful places, attractive cities. And that means that the inequality gap between people living in those areas and people living in the old industrial, let alone agricultural areas, is intensifying. And so this is something else deeply embedded in the nature of the modern economy and the nature of its activities that is making everything worse. Another factor, a fourth set of factors, is something that you certainly know about in this country, and it's the more obvious aspect of globalization, of the spread of manufacturing activities to new parts of the world. But although this has been happening for quite a while, there are two particular events that both happen at the same time in the early 1990s. One was the ending of the multi-fiber agreement, which was a protectionist agreement limiting the import of clothing and textiles from the Far East into Europe and Japan and the United States and other rich countries in order to protect employment in those industries. That protectionist agreement came to an end in the early 1990s, and it's since then that the real spread of all of those activities went out to China and Bangladesh and elsewhere, with effects certainly on Portugal and Italy and Spain. The other thing that happened in the early 90s, of course, was the entry into the capitalist economy of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which in some cases, especially the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, one thing that communism did achieve was quite a high level of engineering skills and other manufacturing skills. And these countries therefore had low wages because they're very poor, or they were very poor, but quite a lot of skills. And so a lot of engineering activity, motor car manufacturer, for example, moved to Central and Eastern Europe. So during the 1990s, these two major events happen, which lead to a very rapid decline in mass production industry. Now, mass production industry, ever since the days of Henry Ford, has played an important part in reducing inequality, because what it did was to put technology at the disposal of relatively low-skilled, low-productivity workers. And that enabled, so machinery boosted the quality of their labor, and that enabled their incomes to rise. And this is the great secret of Fordism, that technology plus low-skilled labor equals high wages. And that brought the vast majority of low and semi-skilled manual workers out of poverty. Also, something else, a separate thing that was an important reinforcement of incomes of many low-skilled people was low-level public service jobs, collecting refuse, looking after public parks. A large number of low-skilled people found employment in local government and public service generally that was not highly paid, but was secure. You got secure conditions. You might be poor, but you didn't worry that you would lose your job because it was stable employment. It was, demand and supply, economic cycles didn't really affect much the need for rubbish to be collected. Now, those low-skilled jobs in manufacturing, the mass production industries, they have been hollowed out and have not entirely, but largely left the existing advanced countries. Meanwhile, the pressure on public finances resulting from changes in taxation and also from some automation have led to a huge drop in the numbers of people being employed in low-skilled public services, and also finally an end to the security of work they used to have. Increasingly that kind of employment is precarious. So the two big supports of the mid-20th century economy that kept low-skilled people at a reasonably secure, reasonable incomes have just been taken away from them. Now, the first person to notice this was likely to happen was the German political scientist Fritz Scharpf. He wrote about this in the mid-90s. And he said, where are these people going to work in future? What on earth is the future of relatively low-skilled people? Yeah, okay, some people can be trained and they will become high-skilled, but there's still always going to be a lot of people who aren't very skillful and not very productive. What's going to happen to them? And he thought, and most of us thought at that time, that there would just be permanent high unemployment. In the end, the capitalism found an answer. And that was, yeah, they can get incomes, they can get work, provided it's extremely precarious. See, they're no longer working in jobs so much where they're boosted by technology, but firms will find it profitable to employ them if they get rid of them very quickly. And so what's happened, one of the consequences of this collapse of the former guarantees of the security of low-skilled people is that they're in work, but their crisis takes the form of precarious employment of various kinds, either temporary contracts or phenomenon that we have a lot in my country of people being classed as self-employed when they're not really. Forced self-employment, it's called. So the employer takes no responsibility for them whatsoever. They're counted as though they're individual firms, but actually they're not. They're completely dependent on the one employer. So that's been another a cause of a kind of change in the nature of the inequality debate and shifting it on to this issue of precariousness, which you're going to talk about later today as well. Then there's another effect, another factor. I suppose it's been covered by some of the other things I've said, but just to concentrate on it, there has been this, at the one level, there has been a growth in jobs for skilled people. There's been across the last 30 years, because of technological change, and the possibility of doing a lot of new things that we didn't know we could do before, there has been an overall growth in the skill level of the economy. A larger number of people today have the chance of getting good incomes in skilled work than 30 years ago. At the same time, for other people, the less skilled people, there's the things I've just been talking about. So there's that gap opens up between the high and the low skilled. And this then raises an interesting question as to how long that can go on for, which is, back in the 1970s, the great Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen said that there was always a race between technology and education, in that advances in technology destroyed jobs. Advances in education made it possible for people to take on new kinds of jobs. And provided the education could expand to do that, then the negative effect of technological change could be wiped out. And so far, that's what's happened, that the overall improvements in the skill level of the population have meant new activities have developed to offset the destruction that's been going on. But there are several problems with the model. One is that there is a transition period, that the fact that some jobs have been destroyed, labour released, and labour got more skilled, doesn't necessarily mean that immediately there are employment opportunities for those people. So there's a delay, there's a period of disruption when unemployment goes up, precarious employment goes up. So and you're never quite sure how long that's going to be for. Secondly, of course, it does mean a rise in overall inequality, and as I've talked about, because the high skilled and the low skilled move further away from each other. And then thirdly, we never know how long it's going to be going on that education is able to keep up with technological change. Now, every few years, certainly throughout my life, which is now a very long time, every few years people say, automation is going to make us all redundant. Keynes, back in the 1940s, I suppose it was, perhaps 30s, wrote about the coming leisure problem. That people would have to work for, there would be so little work around that people would just have leisure to consume, and what would they do with themselves? And there was a fear that there would just be massive surplus labour, and then it moved on to more negative feelings, not so much about leisure, but there'd be massive unemployment because of robots in factories. Now it's about artificial intelligence, and this has become a much more exciting thing for commentators, because in the past it's mainly been about manual workers who are being replaced by robots. This is now about the key professions. Artificial intelligence might make the work of medical practitioners, lawyers, accountants and bankers redundant. So now everybody's very scared. Now, what has happened so far throughout history is that technology has liberated people to go on and do more important things with their time. Just and two interesting examples. The invention of printing, which happened quite a long while ago, made redundant what had been one of the most highly skilled activities, and that was copying. Only very skilled, literate people with very good hand could copy documents. So and monks were employed all over Europe just copying, all day long copying. The only way to reproduce a document. Now, printing killed that skill, but that didn't mean that there was no work left to do for people who had literacy. It just meant they didn't have to spend their lives copying. They moved on to more advanced things. A different example, but from the same area. About 25 years ago, computers began to move into offices in a big way. And secretaries who had spent their lives typing, right, found that wasn't needed anymore because their bosses did their own typing on word processors. But secretaries, if you watch carefully what was happening in offices, people who were employed as secretaries moved on to do more advanced things. They would find other things to do. No one ever recognized it. No one ever saw this as a great improvement in productivity. But people just used their time and their skill to just make everything more efficient. And they found that much more interesting than typing. So technology's threat to employment is not always negative. But we don't know how long it will go on being like that. And then what will we do if we don't need each other's work anymore? Because we need each other to buy the products of our work. But if nobody's work is needed, nobody's earning income to enable them to buy the products of each other's work. So what will we do then? I think you'll probably be discussing that later today as well. But these are the forces that have been producing the increase in inequality. What can be done? If people did suddenly start to get very worried about this, and there was a new politics of inequality, what would it have to be about? And I think the first thing we notice is that it really has to be about international action. There are a few things individual nation states can do, but the overall issues of regulating international finance and of making the globalization process a bit more sensitive to human needs require international action. Particularly thinking of globalization. The speed at which globalization has been happening has meant, obviously, a lot of people in what we used to call the third world have actually started to get better incomes. One of the strange aspects of inequality is that within almost every country in the world, from Denmark to China, inequality has been increasing. In China, massively. But over the world as a whole, there is now less inequality than there was, because the globalization has enabled ordinary working people in China, India, Bangladesh, right across Africa is largely, with the exception of South Africa, Africa is very largely outside all of this still. But Latin America, Asia, that now people are being part of the global economy. They are actually improving their standard of living. They're living for longer. Their children are living for longer. Their children are getting better education. They're getting better health care. So overall, the world has got less unequal, but within any individual country or world region, inequality has intensified. It's possible for this to happen, right? Now, but there is a problem. So globalization has meant that people in China have got more wealthy and have far better lives than they had, but China itself has become very unequal, and people are working very, very long hours, children are working, there is slavery, and they're working in very, very heavily polluted environments. If there were global regulation of working life, then China would have grown more slowly, so these improvements in life would have happened more slowly, but also the negative aspects of that development would have been less. And meanwhile, in the advanced world, the globalization would have had the impact of globalization on employment in sectors like steel and textiles and clothing, coal mining, would have been slower, and there'd have been a better chance to adapt to it without the big shocks that there have been to people's lives. So had there been global regulation of, and a third thing also, in the advanced countries, products would have cost more. If jeans and T-shirts were not being made by slaves or by women working 18 hours a day, they would cost more. Not much more, but they would cost more. You'd have to, we get cheap clothes because people are having horrible working lives. So if we had if globalization had been regulated in some way, everyone would have lost in some way, but we would also all have gained in some way, right across the world. So it's a kind of exchange. Now, this could happen because the World Trade Organization could have rules about could have social clauses. See, at the moment, the WTO is a purely neoliberal regime that if you enter the World Trade Organization's world of low tariffs, then it's because you've met certain criteria of allowing free competition and you trade fairly. But it doesn't have anything in it about working conditions. And it could. It's just an act of political will. You could say that the International Labour Organization has about 8 conventions on working life, and they're about the things I've been talking about length of hours of work, about age at which people are allowed to work, and about slavery. If in order to join the World Trade Organization regime, you had to fulfill those conditions of labour circumstances, and that was inspected and monitored properly, then obviously countries would have a very big incentive to improve working life. If they did that, yeah, they'd have grown more slowly, but they'd have grown more healthily, and we would have had more we'd have had to spend more money buying our jeans and T-shirts and other things, but we'd have also had a more gradual set of shocks to our own production system. So there was a political choice there, but actually that political choice was never confronted because there was no movement, only very, very weak movements to say that the world trading rules ought to include social clauses. There is no major democratic debate about that. I mean, Donald Trump will say he's going to stop imports of steel and aluminium, but he doesn't say it's important that we get some sort of social clauses in world trade. There's no way it would even enter his consciousness to say that. Actually, if anybody has done anything about doing that, it has been the American trade unions have tried, but they're extremely weak. So there could be a politics around the world trading regime. But there isn't, because in our national politics, we never discuss international issues. We almost never have a debate in a country that says, where opposition say, our government is disgraceful, it has not done anything to achieve certain goals within the IMF or the World Trade Organization. We simply don't have that as part of our consciousness. It's just beginning to change now. The major problems around taxing the internet giants, who claim they have no geographical location on the planet, like Google and Amazon, so they manage to escape taxation everywhere. Even the British government has started to say in recent weeks, there may need to be international action here. We can't do this alone. Because clearly all governments, no matter what their politics, have an interest in getting some taxation out of these enormously profitable firms, and no one's getting it at the moment. So finally there's an incentive, but that could be something that we had in our democratic debates in countries. What are we doing to improve the global regimes? A second area where I think there is scope for democratic politics is, and this is difficult. We go back to this problem that we're finding countries compete with each other to attract firms, investment, and they do this by reducing taxation or giving tax holidays, which is causing a crisis of public spending and dumping taxation on the ordinary working population. It may be that we need to move to a different model of business taxes. Firms will certainly say, well, we will put our new investment where the lowest taxes are. Right? And if you've got very high business taxes, we won't locate in your country. But firms will never say, we won't sell goods to your population because you tax us. They will never threaten, firms will never say, we're not going to sell goods in Sweden because you have high taxes. They want consumers wherever they're to be found. So it may be we have to start thinking of shifting the taxation of business from profit to sales, to the point of sale. Now, there's a problem there because sales taxes are regressive taxes, as you know. And so what's the trade-off there? You would get more taxation out of firms. So you say to Amazon, we don't care if you're not located on this planet. You're selling goods in this planet, right? And we know we know exactly what value added you've got from selling goods to our population, and we're going to tax you on that. Now, but that's then a sales tax and a regressive tax. But on the other hand, is that offset by the fact you're getting tax out of these people who you're getting nothing from at the moment? And so the tax will be that much less. Now, some economists argue that all taxes on firms are actually paid by consumers anyway, because it comes through in prices. But there is an issue there about how can we solve this problem of tax competition, and is it worthwhile shifting to sales taxes? Also, it may well be that in order to provide secure working lives for low-skilled people, public policy has to assume more responsibility for them, that we can't expect firms to be providing secure incomes, secure working conditions for people. It may be that public policy has to accept that in order for these people to get employment, it's that the responsibility for them has got to shift to all of us and not to their employers. This is problematic. We've had this a bit in Britain, the idea of through taxation subsidizing the wages of people who earn below a certain level. Now, a lot of people criticize this because they say it simply enables employers to pay lower wages. But on the other hand, it may be the only way we can maintain people in a decent level of living while also working. It's a difficult one, but it needs debate, and it needs to enter the political debate. And then finally, I'll just end now on the final issue. One of the things that has happened with as a result of a number of social changes is that we are increasingly thinking of ourselves as consumers rather than as workers. I've mentioned the way in which globalization has done this, because globalization has given us access to cheap products from developing countries. So as consumers we have gained, right? But at the cost of workers. So you can buy a cheap Chinese T-shirt instead of one made by a Portuguese factory. So you've got a cheaper T-shirt, but a factory is closed somewhere in Portugal. Now, so as consumers, we've gained. As workers, people have lost. And this has been a very major part of the globalization deal for people in the wealthier countries. We are consumers much more than we are workers. And alongside that, of course, has come the enormous growth of advertising activity, marketing, and more and more sophisticated ways of selling us goods, with the internet selling in particular, while on the other side, the things that enable us to think of ourselves as workers, trade unions, have been declining and declining. So one of the big shifts that's happened is we've been encouraged to be consumers and to ignore ourselves as workers. And that has interesting implications for inequality, because in a way, the decline of work for many people, decline in the quality of work, has been compensated for by ability to get cheaper products. But that doesn't actually reduce inequality. It just makes inequality a bit easier to bear. So again, a democracy around inequality needs to adjust the priority that we place on consumption as opposed to work. I'll stop there.